I have been obsessed with these charts ever since I came across them about a month ago. And so I'm going to talk you through them and see what I think we can see from this data. So if you are subscribed to this channel, you know I like to use data to try to find outliers to win fantasy baseball. So if you want to subscribe to the channel for that. And so one thing that we're going to talk through today is that exit velocity is not enough. I remember, 10 years ago when Statcast just kind of started becoming a thing. And even before we had public access to it, I read an article on Fangraphs that said, hey, there's this minor leaguer named Aaron Judge who just posted an exit velocity on par with Giancarlo Stanton up in the majors. And that was all I needed to see in order to grab Aaron Judge before I won my fantasy baseball league did. And then it's obviously paid dividends for me since then. However, since then we have way more data. I believe we're in the golden age of fantasy baseball managers because we have way more public data available to us than ever before to make decisions to find better players. Today I want to walk you through this chart here, and I'm going to slice and dice in so many different directions to try to help make sense of it. It's helped me make more sense. We have so much data available to us. You got barrel rates, you got sweet spot launch angles, you got, exit velocities, you got all this kind of stuff, regular launch angles, what is important and not, and I think by slicing this data it will be. So I came across this data that has, launch angle versus exit velocity, and it reports the weighted on base average when you contact the baseball in these areas. Now, if you've watched any, the All-Star game with the home run derby, you can certainly know that when they do the split screen, you don't even have to watch where the ball lands. If a player has a high exit velocity and a relatively high launch angle, 20 to 40 degrees, they're going to be kind of in this red zone where you're going to get most likely a home run or at least a really hard hit ball. And you can see it's rewarded here with an extremely high expected weighted on base average of contact. So this chart took the data actually produced from the major leagues and weighted on base average per contact, and then kind of came up with an overall model. And so that data is very interesting. What also two other things that really struck me with this data when I first saw it is one, outside of this super sweet spot where you're almost guaranteed a home run or something off the top of a wall, wherever the case might be. Everything else is really blue, which is a really low, almost, not very valuable hit, right? So there's only really this high red area. But you can see here, this white kind of swoosh here as well is also quite valuable. It's a, near a 1 expected weighted on base average per contact. And you can see that's a very high number because that's, way higher than what even Aaron Judge does on the year. So there's this also valuable area here, and everything else is basically garbage, right? So I really started to look at these two areas and say, how do I find players that are in these areas, and everything else is garbage, right? Well, that's kind of what we'll talk through today. However, when I first started looking at this, I was trying to figure out what would make this make sense in the real world of baseball, because this kind of looks like the path of maybe a bat swing or something like that. But what it really ends up being, the more I thought about it, is yes, when you hit it really high and really hard and really far, you get a home run here. And however, at some point you have this kind of zone here, which we'll talk about more. I'm going to call some of this the Bermuda Triangle. This ends up really being the area where outfielders can catch the ball. And then this sweet spot here, this extra little swoosh here, is actually kind of where you get more line drives that can fall in between the infield and the outfield. And I think that's why this is most valuable. So originally I thought this looked like bat path stuff. I was going down a rabbit hole with that, but it really is almost how the field works, where you've got a bunch of garbage and junk where you hit into the infield, a sweet spot where you can kind of get in between them, garbage and junk where you just fly out, and then when you hit it too far, then it's a super valuable home run, right? So we're going to look through in different areas. And why this shape looks like this is because, we'll go on a slight tangent here, is when you look at the catch probability, it talks about hang time versus the distance traveled and how likely are to catch the ball, right? So obviously, if the ball hangs in the air for a long time and the fielder doesn't have to go very far to go get it, they're likely to catch the ball, right? Whereas if the hang time is really low, 3.5, 4 seconds, like you hit a line drive and it goes very far away from the fielder, they're going to be less likely to track it down. And that's what this data looks like. So based on overlying this type of data on how much ground a player can coverage and how much time, and then where your ball is going to go based on your launch angle and your exit velocity and how much hang time you're going to get from that and distance from the outfielder kind of lays into this, right? If that makes sense. And that's how, using this catch, probability data, you can get to the expected outs above average, where you can see PCA, Pete Crow Armstrong, has the highest, outs above average, because for those areas where it should only be a 0 to 25% chance of catching the ball, he actually catches the ball almost 60% of the time. He had 32 opportunities with balls that are way out of his range, and he caught 19 of them, right? And it goes up from there. So it was on overall, his average of actually catching a ball versus expectation is very high. So that's why he's one of the best center fielders in the game. But that's kind of a side tangent on that, but super interesting note as well to see how they assess that kind of value. So now when we look at players who have the highest expected weighted on-base average per contact, and it's all the guys you'd expect to see: Judge, Shohei, Kyle Schwarber, James Wood would be an interesting one. We'll talk a little bit later, Soto and so forth. And what they all have in common, you can see, is they have really high hard hit rates, which means they impact the ball above 95 miles per hour exit velocity. They also have relatively high barrel rates. We'll talk about barrels specifically, but that's, a little bit higher number. It takes into account both how hard you hit it, above like 98, 99 miles an hour, and then also the launch angle to make sure you get into kind of that sweet spot we talked about before. And then how many barrels they actually have. And then the launch angle sweet spot is also pretty good for most of these players, which is when they get into, we'll talk about that in a second. But that's why you end up being some of the highest producing players, because you're really high in all these kind of bat metrics that they're looking at. That's not very a surprise thing, but we're going to look in some of the weeds and see if we can find some hidden data, or I think some flaws in some of this data, especially the sweet spot launch angle. So we should talk about sweet spot launch angle. So the definition is really when the ball impacts the bat, you return a ball that goes in the air between 8 degrees and 32 degrees. That's the sweet spot. If obviously everybody knows, if you hit it, well below that, that's a ground ball. You topped it. Fielders are likely to catch that. You hit it, get way too under it, that's a pop-up or a fly-out. The outfielders are going to get that. So there's some point in the middle that's good, and they talk about this broad 8 degrees to 32 degrees sweet spot angle, because in there, yes, below 10 you get get ground balls. Line drives are 10 to 25, so it's kind of within that range, just a little bit broader. And then 25 to 50 you get fly balls or pop-ups, right? So that kind of makes sense. However, when you start to look at next with barrels and so forth, you can see a barrel has a slightly different definition. A barrel is defined as, a ball having at least 98 miles per hour exit velocity, and with a launch angle between 26 and 30 degrees, and then broader from there. So looking at when you have an exit velocity here, 98 miles per hour, and then you've got this kind of 26 to 30, and then it kind of expands out as you hit the ball even harder, you get a barrel. But I think with that, obviously important is the launch angle and stuff like that. But I think one of the challenges with that launch angle sweet spot of being between 8 and 32 degrees and just blanket giving you a result for that. I haven't looked anywhere where they actually, really break that out further from that. But there's a huge trap, because if you look at this data where I go back to the chart and you just slice out really all the balls that go over hard hits, right? Everything that goes above, kind of 95 miles an hour, this is what it looks like. But you can see here, you actually have, this Bermuda Triangle of a black hole here, where you have hit the ball really hard, but you haven't quite barreled it. And now, depending on your launch angle, it's going to be very important whether you're in this black hole of not performing well, right? So you can see here, this ends up being, you have a 0 launch angle and you have a 50-degree launch angle. That's why the barrel's here in the middle around 25%. And they talk about the sweet spot starting here, probably here around 8%, and going up to 32 or so forth. But if you have barreled the ball and you're somewhere between 95 to 105 mile per hour exit velocity, I don't know these exact numbers here, but I'm going to make a guess. If your launch angle is around 15% and you do that, you are not going to have a great outcome. Maybe that means, someone has a chance to catch it for those reasons. It hangs in the air long enough, but it does not hard hit enough to actually have a great outcome. People have a chance to catch the ball, but that is what I'm really fascinated in, is why is there kind of this black hole here? And I don't believe it's important to look at launch angle, sweet spot percentage, but I don't think it tells you the whole story until you combine it with, exactly the exit velocity and whether or not you have a barrel. So that's kind of what we're going to dig through, and we're going to slice it through in a couple of different ways, since this is super fascinating to me, and hope it's fascinating to you. But eventually we'll get to the point where you can identify some outlier performances. So now, just looking at barrels specifically, barrels per plate appearance, of course, it's the same kind of, the names at the top here: Judge, Shohei Ohtani, Pete Alonso, Kyle Schwarber, even Kyle Stowers, actually, even though he did great because he missed a lot of last season. Cal Raleigh, all these guys were kind of in the MVP conversations as well. And so what's shocking to me is obviously you get barrels per plate appearance, and Aaron Judge is just phenomenal at that, and then it kind of tapers off from there. That's something to keep in mind on, because when you're truly barreling the ball, you're likely to get pretty good outcomes, and that's why actually it shouldn't surprise me. But of his 226 hard hit balls, 96 of them had the perfect launch angle and the exit velocity to be considered a barrel. Shohei was 100, and that's almost for the whole year. You're really just playing for how many times you barrel the ball, because that's when you're going to have the most impact, and have a chance to get home runs, doubles, really impact your slugging percentage, right? So now we split this a different way and take a look at a different way. Here's barrels per batted ball event, so how many times they batted the ball. And again here, Judge, Shohei Ohtani, Kyle Schwarber, Cal Raleigh are the highest, whereas per times they hit the ball, their highest percentage chance of barreling the ball is with 25% for Judge, and so forth, and it just kind of drops down off of there. So that's why these guys are outliers in both performance and then you can see here even Nick Kurtz popping up in here, because he didn't have as many barrels, only 50 last year, because he didn't get as many plate appearances, but his barrels per batted ball event is actually quite high, and that's why I'm really interested in someone like him as well. And all these data, O'Neal Cruz keeps popping up. I'll show you how some of the things that hold him back, which is specifically, again, this kind of launch angle is a little bit lower than the other players, so that may be holding them back, and we'll kind of dig through that a little bit later. But now let's go at the highest launch angle people. So who are the outliers for launch angle on the high end? Cal Raleigh is actually last year super high. He had the highest average launch angle, 25.2%. So you could see here is probably up in this range over here with this expected outcomes, but he makes up for it, and it works because he had almost a 50% hard hit rate, a 19% barrel rate, 35% sweet spot, and his launch angle is 25, so he had fantastic outcomes for that, right? So I think that's something you can see here. But now you can see someone like Miguel Vargas, who only had a 9.3% barrel rate, even though he had a relatively high launch angle. That starts to get a little more risk in your profile, because you're not barreling the ball as much. Your hard hit rate's dropping off. Sweet spot was still pretty good. Launch angle was okay, but you're not getting the same, outcomes and results from this. And that's why we'll break it down later. But in seeing who has the highest launch angles, you can drop down here to Ozzie Albies, who's someone I've had for many years and ended up dropping last year. And now I'm feeling more good about my decision, because other people have obviously picked him up and they say, oh, he's still got something. But here you can see with all these high barrels and all the things they're making it work for all these players, here's Judge. Obviously, he's got 19% average launch angle, but 58% hard hit rate, almost 25% barrel, almost 40% sweet spot launch angle. And get to Ozzie Albies, you can see here he has the lowest barrel percentage on this list. So if you have the lowest barrel percentage on this list and one of the lowest hard hit percentage on this list, you don't want your launch angle to be this high at 18%. He is falling in the Bermuda Triangle here far too often, where he's not hitting the ball as hard as the other players. He's certainly not barreling it into the red zone up here. And so that's why I think part of why Ozzie Albies, I'll break it down a little bit further in a little bit, why his breaking down and his performance year after year is he still thinks of himself as a high launch angle guy who can get the barrels and the hard hits and the data from that, but he's really not. And he's actually would probably do better off to make an adjustment to his profile and maybe live down here in the lower end. We'll kind of look at that in a second. These are some of the kind of things that we can look at and break down and see with this to help slice and dice this data to give us some impressions of why some guys really fall off a cliff. There's only really two areas you want to be. You want to be in the red area, or you want to be in the white area. Everywhere else you to return below average results, right? So we want to spend as much time in those zones, and maybe people don't realize how far they've fallen from one zone and how close they could be to reaching another zone if they made some adjustments. So now let's look at the opposite extreme. So who has the lowest launch angle? And I changed it to 400 plate appearances to get some specific people in here, like Chandler Simpson, right? So Chandler Simpson has a launch angle, below, 8's the sweet spot, lower limit. So you're here almost a 0.5, almost nowhere land. So in Chandler Simpson, you can see His hard hit rate was only 17.3%. His barrel rate was 0% because he doesn't hit the ball hard enough or have the right launch angle. His sweet spot percentage was only under 30%. So yeah, no doubt, if you're not hitting hard and getting the right angle, you're not going to have any barrels. And in fact, that's why his is really low. You look at this whole list of players who have relatively low launch angles compared to the ones that we just saw on average, and that's where James Wood pops up. So James Wood has so much potential because he has a really high hard hit rate, he has a really high barrel rate, and he has a decent, okay launch angle sweet spot, but his average launch angle is really low, and it's probably mostly I've seen driven by his ground ball rate. So if he can really figure out how to change that, maybe go to drive line, this is still a profile I would invest in and hope that he can make some tweaks and changes to find a way. I know he's got to fix the strikeouts as well, but also he's got to fix the launch angle. And so from this data, then you can go down here and say, okay, for these people with the really long launch angles, what does it look like for them to be a Major League Baseball player? And this is what it looks like. I just took out everything above like, an 8 or 10 degree, launch angle. And this is the data before you. So for these players who don't have great launch angles and they're just hitting the ball on the ground, this is what the outcomes look like. They're all really poor outcomes. There's almost no really white area or red area you can go to get a really high expected weighted on base average for contacting the ball. And this is one of the reasons why, I struggled in really stolen bases. So a couple years ago, 2023, I had Ron Acuna fully healthy, gave me 70 plus stolen bases, helped me win that category easily. 2024, he gets injured for most of the year. I'm really struggling for stolen bases, and I'm worried about it coming into 2025 because I don't know how much Ron Acuna is going to run. So I pick up Chandler Simpson because he had the fastest guy in the minors, and that's something I'm going to do. However, that profile is really risky, and one of the best articles and things that I read on it is because these players rely on hitting the ball on the ground so much and using their speed to run out the ball to get a high BABIP, right? And so when you're in the minors, yeah, you can get away with that. But one thing that people underestimate is once you get to the majors, it's not going to work because you have the very best fielders with the highest range at all their positions and the best arms, that it's going to be a very hard profile for you to really be successful with that long term. So if there's any slowdown in Chandler Simpson's profile right now, he's kind of making it work. Obviously, he has no true home run power, but he has, good stolen bases. But if he loses a step or two, in his speed or gets injured, then his whole profile is going to become crumbling because his launch angle is one of the lowest in the leagues. So now let's look at the other end of the extremes for the outliers of people who don't have a really high hard hit rate. So if you look at the guys with the lowest hard hit rates in the majors, only 16.7% for Luis Arraez. That makes sense. Jacob Wilson, Sal Frelick, some of the other players here, and that's where you can see Ozzie Albies here. He has one of the highest launch angles with one of the lowest hard hit rates. That seems like an absolutely terrible profile to do. This is what it looks like for you if you have really low hard hit rates. You can see I cut off everything that is a hard hit ball, 95 and above. This is the world that you're going to be living in. In this case, you can see here, this is what I'm obsessed with this data, is now you really don't want to be in that 25-30% launch angle sweet spot range. Launch angle sweet spot may actually be hurting you here because you actually probably want to be closer to that maybe 8 to 10%. I'm not sure exactly where these numbers lie. You want to get into this white band here that is a lot lower because you don't have the exit velocity to get into that red spot that's now gone, right? So in that case, when you look through it through this lens, I see a few outliers here or someone to worry about. That's why you can see here for all these really low hard hit rates, the person with the lowest launch angle, you can see all these 15%, 17%. I feel like you're falling into this Bermuda Triangle here of not really great data. However, Jacob Wilson is actually pretty smart. He has a relatively low launch angle. It's like barely into the zone that is, the 8% to 32%. He's on the low end of that, which is probably where you want to be here in this white edge. So he can probably tap into this area where it's just getting above the infield and falling in before the outfield or whatever this means, and he's making a case of it. So of all the players on this list, especially the ones with the lowest hard hit rates and the lowest barrel rates, he actually has the highest, batting average per contact, because his launch angle is helping him on the low side, whereas people who are on the high side are not performing very well. You can see here some others, and that's Xavier Edwards maybe doing pretty well on that, even though his barrels are low. But as you get further down this list, you get a lot higher. You almost double your hard hit rate, which could help you get some better outcomes versus this true low end that even some of the players are playing with here. But you can see here's Ozzie Albies again. This is why his profile is so concerning. He's someone who has a low hard hit rate, 12th lowest in the majors. He has a low barrel rate, and his launch angle sweet spot's okay, 33%, but his launch angle is the highest on this list again. So he has the highest launch angle with the lowest barrel rate, one of the lowest hard hit rates, and that is an absolutely atrocious profile for a player. So here's someone that I think we can start to worry about a little bit. Is Geraldo Perdomo had an absolutely amazing year last year. And, he had a hard hit rate, 32%, barrel rate pretty good, 6.2%, launch angle sweet spot 36%, and his launch angle was like 15-ish. I don't know if that's fully optimized for him. He might be better off trying to get that lowered a little bit more as well too, just to make sure. But if we see that this starts rising up and any of his hard hit rates start falling, he has a profile that can certainly be high risk, at least to return the type of performance or at least the type of home runs that he had last year. But let's look at how Ozzie Albies has fallen apart over the years because of this. So you can see in 2023, he had almost an 850 OPS, and he's just been dropping off a cliff since then. And that's because now that I start to see, based on that chart and how you slice and dice it, what this is really telling you under the curve. You can see here his profile was getting by back then because he had a 8.2% barrel rate, so about average barrel rate, slightly lower than average hard hit rate, but decent 39%. And his launch angle sweet spot was great at 37%. They don't put the actual launch angle in here. This is something I wish they can look for, and I can try to see if I can dig that in other data. Fast forward a year to 2024, his hard hit rate is now dropping from 39 to 32%. He dropped to the 13th percentile. His launch angle sweet spot has fallen from 37 to 33%, so that's fallen apart, and his barrel rate is fallen from 8.2 to 6.2, now in the 31st percentile. So all those things drop. So he is falling into that Bermuda Triangle black hole of lack of performance, and he even just got worse for him in 2025. Now his barrel rate's down to 4.9%. His hard hit rates dropped to 30.7%. His launch angle sweet spot's 33.5%, holding about the same. So he's just fallen off a cliff, and this is a profile that, unless he makes an adjustment or realizes who he is now at 29, almost 30 years old, it's going to be difficult for him to increase his performance. Right. So now when we look at players with this type of value, because I think this really happens with second basemen a lot, especially if they're a little bit smaller. Ozzie Albies is 5'7", and the question comes up: how do we project the prospects who are second base prospects or shorter prospects based on this data? And I feel like they have so many have underperformed. This is a set of tools I feel like we can use to start to look at it. So huge shout out and kudos to Miguel, who commented, posted, and said it was great, likes my content, some of the other things I was calling out, but he called me out and said, McGonigal has a pretty good hit and power profile and even raw power, game power, when I really tout people like Chase Stellato with a higher injury risk. Of course, I might be, if he feels he has a higher dynasty upside. And I think, really what I was reacting to when I look at this before I saw this chart, or I had really interpreted what it means, is because a lot of second basemen, especially people who are, 5'10", under 6 feet tall, their power profile just doesn't mature. They never really reach their true potential, and that holds them back. And I think maybe I was making a mistake because I was really basing it off of his exit velocities. So even though he has a good 50th exit velocity, because his expected batting average and slugging is pretty good, and overall exit velocity is good, but in looking at the 90th percentile, I'm like, if his 90th percentile exit velocity, what's it really going to look like? But if you look further through the lens of what we just talked about, his barrel rate was, and this is all single A ball. We don't have any, Statcast data available at double A. And so until he gets a triple A or the majors, we're not going to get more Statcast data on him to really see how this is holding up as he advances. But his barrel rate in the minors was fantastic, 12.5%. Hard hit rate was great at 56.2%. They don't have launch angle or launch angle sweet spot on Prospect Savant, so we can't get a good read on where that is right now. but he certainly has some potential here. So I'm willing to say that, hey, I might be eating crow on this. If he's able to maintain this barrel rate and hard hit rate as he comes up, then he probably has the opportunity to outperform the expectations. And I need to readjust my models instead of just looking at max exit velocity and 90th percentile exit velocity, depending on how the launch angles look, and thinking that that's going to limit him. He might find another path here in that lower end, lower launch angle to really be more productive. So let's take a look at it over here as well. So if you look at a profile that I was kind of comparing him to, which power hasn't really been part of his game, but if you look at like Jacob Wilson, when he was in the minors, 24 and 25, AAA data is all we have on him. Similarly, his barrel rate was relatively low, only 2% in 2024. His hard hit rate was only 28%, and they don't have, launch angle in the minors. And then in 2025, his barrel rate was 0%, and his hard hit rate was 28.6%. And as he came to the majors, not shockingly, it's 2.2% barrel rate, 24% hard hit rate, and his launch angle sweet spot was only 32%. So there's certainly going to be not a whole lot of power in his profile. I know that's not exactly part of his game, and that's not who he is. He's more of a contact hitter who squares up the ball more. But I think this kind of helps us see at what point in the minors through the prospect savant data would something like hard hit rate or barrel rate really level out to what we can expect or project for a player who reaches the majors, because it's absolutely obvious, even based on AAA data here, that Kevin McGonigal has potential probably for more hard hit rate, more barrel rate than Jacob Wilson. So he has some potential. Now, that's obviously single A versus AAA data. So we have to see how Kevin McGonigal can perform while hitting harder data and actually tougher pitching in the majors. But that's obviously the potential for the higher outcome is still there, and I may end up eating crow if he can actually deliver on that. So I think now we're actually on the spectrum of, I keep saying, when you look at these undersized prospects, especially middle infield ones that come up with the potential for power, I can do a whole video on them. Maybe I should, on all the ones that have disappointed over the last 10 years, like Franklin Barreto, Zach Geloff, and stuff like that. All these players with some potential that just never lived up to it. And they always kind of get compared to Ozzie Altuve. So I used to say, hey, for every one Ozzie Altuve, you're going to have 10 Franklin Barretos who are going to disappoint you. So what is about Ozzie Altuve that has lived up to it? So now we can kind of see some of this data. So he, at the 35 years old, he's starting to fall off a cliff here now. So his barrel rate is only 6.2%. His hard hit rate, listed in 2025, was 31%. The sweet spot was about 30%. And so that's why he didn't have a great year this last year in the majors. And there's probably a concerning profile going forward. So I wanted to see, when he was at his best, what did it look like? So he won the MVP in 2017. He was third in voting in 2016. But based on this data, 2016 was his best year, his highest expected weighted on base average. And it's because his barrel rate was almost 7%, hard hit rate 36%. His launch angle sweet spot was an amazing almost 40%. So he was really major league average in two of them and exceptional in the third. So this is the type of profile we would hope to look for to see where on the range of Ozzie Altuve's years are these second basemen or undersized prospects coming in, to see what we can think they can project for the majors. And you can see in 2017, when he actually won the MVP, he was averaging two of them, which was barrel rate and launch angle sweet spot, and well below average in hard hit rate, but that was still sufficient overall profile to win the MVP for him for that year. So I think going forward, we can try to compare all these undersized prospects who may have questions about their power or how much of their raw power will show up in games. And we can try to use this data to compare it. And hopefully by slicing and dicing that chart, you can actually see how some of these things are important to try to really hit a place where you can maximize your outcome versus hitting that Bermuda Triangle black hole of non-performance.